right, cool, thanks. Welcome, Apostrophe. They built a CMS that's open source, and they're here to talk about the CMS and deploying to the Civic Cloud, which is another Code4Philly project, and figuring out how to do that in an easy and accessible way. So take it away, Apostrophe.
Sure. Let me start sharing my screen. Can you see?
Yep.
Cool. So hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apostrophe and Docker workshop. Thanks for everyone making the time today. I'm just getting my machine set up here a little bit. Hi, I'm Greg Van Brugge. I'm a senior software engineer with Apostrophe Technologies. It's my contact information down here. You can reach me at gv@apostrophecms.com, and I'm pretty much everywhere else on the internet at Greg Van Brugge. I'm a support engineer with Apostrophe Technologies. Basically what that means is I help enterprise clients build and deploy Apostrophe sites. I spend most of my time writing JavaScript. Prior to being here, I also did a lot of single page applications, and we used Docker to kind of containerize them and deploy them. And that went from everything from single static single page applications to static websites to WordPress sites, etc. Yeah. So since this is a remote workshop, I have not done a remote one before, so we're going to try a couple things. There's two tools that we can use. We'll see how this goes. There's a plugin for VS Code called Live Share, and another one called Teletype for Atom. I'm probably one of the only people that still uses Atom, but if you use that, there's also this extension. And basically what these two things do, if you install these in your editors, during some of these working parts of the talk, you can actually share a link with me and I can get into your editor and see kind of like your terminal, the code you're writing, and in some cases even your browser window itself. So if you want to share with me, we can give that a shot. We'll kind of see how that goes. So what we're going to cover.
That some product times product, just call it P or something inside the CTE.
Say that one more time. I think I didn't hear you. No. Okay. So what we're going to cover today, I'm going to give a little bit of a general overview of Docker, kind of how you can build and run a Docker image. We're going to cover Apostrophe and what that is and how you can use it to create websites. And then we'll go through how you could Dockerize Apostrophe and deploy that into your cloud. So some of the requirements for today, I'm sure all of you have Git installed. We'll need Node for part of this. I will say on the Apostrophe documentation, it does say 4x or better, but I would recommend at least 8. I think the Node support for 8 ended in January of this year. And just for context, I'm currently on 12. If you don't have a way to kind of switch versions, MDM is a good option to switch between different versions of Node. You'll need MongoDB. This is a Apostrophe requirement, at least 2.6. I'm currently running 4.2. And Docker of at least 1.13.0. The numbers are kind of weird. I'm currently on 19.03.8, which is the most current one. But I think 1.13 was like maybe 2 or 3 years old. Main thing we want is something called Docker Compose version 3, and that shipped with this 1.13.0 at least. And then lastly, I have a repository up with some examples that we'll get into a little bit later that you can kind of follow along and use those as starting points as you're kind of like working through it, some of these to-dos that I'm going to put up. And that's on my GitHub, Greg Van Brugge, Apos Docker workshop. One thing about that, there is 2 branches, master and examples. Master is just kind of the one you can start from, and examples is a working example. If you get stuck, you could switch the branch and kind of see how it would work. Okay, so I know you guys have done a little bit of Docker, but I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview just for those that may have not. So what is Docker? Docker is defined as an open platform for developing, shipping, and running applications. In my opinion, that's kind of a non-definition. It kind of doesn't really tell anything of what it does. They also have this tagline of debugging your app and not your environment, which kind of hints at kind of what it does. So what it actually does is it gives you the ability to package and run an application in a loosely isolated environment called a container. That's basically the core of what Docker is, and that's kind of the beauty of it. It debuted in about 2013, and it's been around since about 2010. So it's got about 10 years of development behind it. It's pretty stable, and a lot of companies are using it to deploy their applications. One of the things that differentiates it from something like Vagrant is it runs directly on the host machine's kernel. So what that allows it to do is have very lightweight and smaller containers. The entire goal of a container is trying to make it as small as possible so that you can run multiple of these and kind of like create and delete them as necessary. There's 3 main parts to the Docker ecosystem. That's the server, which I'll show in a second, the client, and the registry. So the Docker server. Also, am I going too fast? If I am, just feel free to post something in the chat. I'm trying to pay attention a little bit. So what the Docker server is, if you just install the Docker desktop app, this is basically what you get. It's a way for you to see the containers that you have running on your machine, any other kind of networks or services that might be running, all shown in this GUI. It's really the daemon process in the background. That's like kind of the Docker command, D-O-C-K-E-R-D, not D-O-C-K-E-R. That's basically the server that's running, that's providing a connection to Docker. The next thing is the client. All right, I'm having some technical difficulties here. There we go. The second way, the command line interface is a way to connect with the daemon that's in the background. This is basically like gives the API interface for you to interact with the server, and it's basically the Docker command. And then lastly, there's the registry, and this is the initial images that are published to the public. This one in particular is interesting because you can actually run your own registry if you want. So this Docker image is actually to create your own private registry if you wanted to do that too. Sorry, can you still hear me? Okay. So this would be like if you want to run Apache or Node or something, it's basically that's your container. Sounds like Tom can't hear me. Hello? Better? Okay, it seems like we're having some video problems. All right, I'll just repeat that real quick. So images are the basic set of instructions to complete a version of your application. This would be like if you want to run a node container with an Express server in it. The next piece is the containers. Containers are basically an instance of an image. The idea behind that is that the containers basically are reproducible versions of the images, and they can be disposed of. That's kind of a good thing and a bad thing. So if you think about that, like whatever you put in a container is meant to be destroyed. We'll get to like why that might be a bad thing a little bit later. Volumes is the next kind of Docker object. These are basically, sorry, I'm having some issues. A directory to share or persist data between a container itself and the host machine. The next kind of object is a network, and these are connected containers or services. And then services are one or more containers with a configuration running together. We'll kind of get to these last two a little bit later, the networks and services. For right now, we're going to focus mainly on the images and containers. Oops. Okay, so if you haven't already, make sure Docker is installed on your machine and make sure the server is starting. There's a quick how-to on this version of my repository if you want to take a look. I'll kind of give you guys maybe like 5 minutes if you need time to do that. Does anybody need time to do that? Okay, cool. So we'll pause for like maybe 2 minutes while that gets downloaded. And then we'll move on to creating and building an image. Also, if you don't have it installed, you can install it from here. Cool. So does everybody have Docker running on their machine now? I'm going to say that is a yes. So now that you have Docker installed, what we're going to start doing is learning how we build and run a Docker image. The main way you do that is through a Dockerfile. This is a very basic one, but it is a complete Dockerfile. All we're really doing here is using a couple commands, the from command to pick an image from the registry that we're going to use. So I'm going to use node 12. I'm going to copy some files from my local system to the container itself. And then I'm going to run a command in the container to start my application. So one of the things that is a little bit confusing when you start using Docker is understanding the difference between the file path on your machine and the file path within the container. And that's all going to be relative to the type of image that you're running. So in Node, I know I have this user source directory and I can put things there, and that's where I'm going to run my app. Some common Dockerfile commands. There isn't really a whole lot to Dockerfiles, and in theory too, they should be pretty slim. You don't want to do a whole lot of things within the image itself, because what you're starting to do is build a bigger container the more things that you put into it. So common commands are the ones here on the left that are highlighted a little bit lighter, and the less common ones are on the right here. I'll explain why a little bit later. But just to go through these real quick, the first one is the from command, and that is basically picking your base image from the registry itself. This could be one that you created and pushed to the registry, or one of the official ones. One thing to note, when you're pulling an image, it's very important to know kind of what's happening within the image itself. I try and stick to at least the official images, because it is there is a potential for someone to do something in an image that you don't know is going on, and that could potentially put a vulnerability in your image. So just make sure you check the documentation on the image before you start using it. The maintainer is basically just giving a full name and email address to the person that created the image. The env command is setting some environment variables. You can do that directly in the Docker file itself. Workdir is setting a path where the command or defined commands are to be executed. So it's basically like a shortcut of like cding to a directory and using that as a route to run your commands from that point forward. Copy is a way to copy files from the host machine to the container's file system at a set destination. Typically this has like a from to. Add is similar to copy. The difference here is that it allows you to set a source as a URL, and it will unpack local tar archives. It does not unpack tars from URLs, but that's the main difference between add and copy. Most times I would say I probably use copy way more often than I ever use add, but know that that is built in too. Run is a command that you can use to run executables within the container itself. Expose is a command that allows you to expose the port to the network and the outside world. And the command is basically the root command that's going to be run when the container starts. The ones on the right here that aren't, I'll explain them, but I'll explain kind of why they're not quite as frequently used a little bit later when we get into networking. So the volume is a way to set a directory from the host to the container. This is kind of a way that you can persist data in the container. Entry point is a way to set a default application to be used every time the container is used within the image. A user sets the UDID or the username, which is to run the container. So if you didn't want to run something as like root, you can switch it here. And then label allows you to add a label to your Docker image. I don't think I've ever used that command before. So I'm not going to go into that one a whole lot. So the basic way that you would build and run an image are these two commands. The Docker image build, I'm going to use dot as the root, and this is going to assume that I have a Docker file within the directory that I'm running. And then I'm going to give it a tag. What this basically means is now I've created an image that I can start to create multiple containers off this same thing. And then to run that image, I can use the Docker container run command. I'm going to publish it. It's going to make the port available to, it's going to expose the port 8000 to 8080. Detached just means it's running in the background. And then I'm going to give my container a name of image and use the my image 1.0 that I created in the last build. Any questions on that before I get into some other Docker commands? Okay. That is basically the same steps that you would do every single time to create an image and run a container. Some other common Docker CLI commands is this list, and just note that some of these might be child commands of the Docker objects you want to perform a command on. So for example, in the last one, we ran Docker image build and Docker container run. Both of those are child commands of those Docker objects. So build is how you can basically build an image from a Docker file. Run is how you create and start the container. CP is a way to copy files and folders between a container and the local file system. Sometimes you might want to do this if you want to check a particular config locally on your machine. You could basically use this command to copy it from inside the container to your host so you could see what was in there. Docker exec basically allows you to sort of SSH into the container itself, where you can, you might want to like make sure all your files got mounted in the right spot, or make sure your configs are located in the right spot. Exec is really helpful for debugging some issues that might have come through building the image in the container. PS is a command that will allow you to list Docker containers that are currently running. Start is how you start a container that was previously created. So if I ran, if I created a container and stopped it, I could restart it using the same name from the prior build. Restart allows me to restart a container. So if there was something that went wrong and I needed to restart it, I can use that command to restart it. Stop, probably pretty obvious, but it stops the container from running. And then RM is a way to remove a container, and RMI is a way to remove an image. So with that, we can take a little bit of a break and see if we can create a Docker image that runs an Express server. If you haven't used Express before, there is an example of a really, really basic rudimentary Express server in this version of the repository. And you can use that as a base for starting your image. One thing to note, obviously Express is a node server, so you probably want to use node as a base for your image. And if you've worked with node before, you know that you need to install the dependencies in the container as well for node to be able to run. So just take that in mind when you are creating your image. If you get super stuck, feel free to post a link in the chat and we can either try and debug it using either of those VS Code tools or Teletype. Or if you want to check, just switch the branch to your example in the repository, and you can get a hint there too. We'll give this like 5 or so minutes if anybody wants to try it out. And I'll just hang out and see if anyone needs help. So Alex asked if we should start composing our own Docker files here. You can in that repository. Yes. Oh, sorry. I truncated the link here, but let me, I'll post a link to the repository that I'm talking about. Oops. Where is the chat? Is there anyone that's just totally lost? This is really weird doing a workshop where I have basically like no one talking back.
Only organizers, by the way, have access to talk back.
Okay.
Participants might talk in the chat.
Okay. Am I moving too fast?
I unmuted, I allowed all the guests to talk.
Okay.
I'm following along just fine. And while I've been coding for a suspicious number of years, I've not been Dockering for all that long. So.
Whoops. Whoops. So this is kind of like a real simple basic example. This is probably pretty close to something that you're going to be doing in your image as well. To use in the container. If you're using the repository, there should be an app.js file there. And to get the dependencies into the container, if you're familiar with Node, there's a package JSON file that you'll want to include in your container as well. And then you can run the npm install command in there to install the dependencies. So all of those things are dependent on the image that you're building from. So for example, like if you're building something that isn't a Node container, the npm command is not going to be available because it's not in that image. You could add it into something if you were doing like something in Node and you wanted to build your stuff in there, but it's not going to be available at the start. And it's probably like a bad idea to install it because it gives extra stuff in there that you don't necessarily need to run your application. If you're doing Node, you probably want to use a Node server. If you're using something like a basic HTTP server, you might want to use something like Apache or Nginx. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. trying to see if I can fix my connection too real quick. One thing to note too, if you start to create your container and something went wrong, I think there's some notes in the repository for this, but basically like that image is a set thing. So it's basically like cached in your system. So you need to tell it to rebuild in order to start a new container with your changes. Let's see if I can pull that up. And if that happens, a real simple, easy way to clean your system is to use this Docker prune A. Just note that this is going to remove any kind of image or container that you have set on your system. So if there's something that you do not want to delete, this is probably not a good way to do it. You can just remove the image and container itself separately, but I'm assuming most people haven't used a whole lot here, so they shouldn't be all that destructive. Oh, so yeah, Alex just posted in the channel. In order to test to see if the image is working correctly, you should be able to visit localhost 3000 on your browser. And if that is running, you should have basically like hello world printed in your web browser. Let me. Cool. It looks like people, this is working. While you're creating the Docker image, you'll see there's a series of steps that prints in your log. Basically, all of those things that are happening are a single line that's in that Docker file. So you should be able to see kind of like if you have something that starts to break, you should be able to see where in your Dockerfile commands that kind of broke. By taking a look at this log, you should be able to see kind of like where your problem is a little bit. Do people want a couple more minutes or should we start to move on? Okay. Since it sounds like everybody has something that's pretty close, I think we can probably move on. The next thing I'm going to talk about is Apostrophe. Real loosely defined, Apostrophe is an open source enterprise level CMS. It's powered by Node. It stores data with MongoDB. It uses the Express web framework and renders templates with the Nunjuc's templating language. Main features are in-context editing. There's a built-in image and file library, and extensible content types, which are called pieces in Apostrophe. It's completely customizable, and that goes for anything that is on the front end or the back end. So it's extremely flexible, and it's used to power all kinds of websites from small nonprofits to Fortune 500s, colleges, research platforms, etc. The main kind of like three things in Apostrophe, real basic, are pieces, pages, and widgets. These first two, pieces and pages, at the core, they're basically like a doc in Apostrophe. The main difference between like these pieces and pages is kind of like the way that they are treated. So like a piece is kind of more like a collection of things, and opposed to like a page, which can be managed like as a tree. Pieces are basically content types. They're flexible. You can kind of customize them any way that you need. Pages are basically single instances. Pieces can have pages. And that's basically like how you display content on your site. And then widgets are kind of like a third thing in Apostrophe. And what these allow are editable regions of the website. As mentioned before, everything in Apostrophe can be edited in context. What widgets is the thing that powers this to the front end. At the core, Apostrophe is basically made out of modules. All the official Apostrophe modules are prefixed with apostrophe, but real simple, all a module is really an index.js file, and it's registered, sorry, with an app.js, in the app.js file, sorry. Realistically, a module kind of looks more something like this. There are some kind of like special directories in Apostrophe that kind of mean things. So you might have like a lib directory, and this is kind of where you might do some routing, some API stuff, any kind of like additional functionality that you might want to add to your module. A public directory, this is kind of like where you store your CSS, JavaScript, anything that might apply to this module. These file names are kind of not special, but kind of are. Apostrophe does have a concept of scenes where you might have a user or anonymous. So what these three things are is like, if I have something that I always want to push to a browser, I'll kind of show this in a second. I can have this always file, which means I always want the browser to get these assets, versus anonymous. And this is basically if a user is not logged in or when a user is logged in. And how you do that is basically something like this. So in your module, you might have a constructor that has this push asset where you're pushing your type. And that's kind of the script or style sheet, the name of the file. So if I want to push that always file from the previous example, this is where that file is named. And then when should it get pushed to the browser? Always meaning always versus anonymous or when a user is logged in. Views are how content gets displayed. These file names are sort of special in the case of pieces, but you can basically name your files anything you want in here. It just depends on how you push them to, how you, sorry. Sorry. It just depends on how you push them when they get viewed. So in the case of like this being a piece, I might have a pieces pages, and these first two index or show, meaning when the index page for the piece is being displayed, it'll automatically pick up that file. Versus if I have a like a detail page, the show page will get shown. Widget is special to widgets. That is the default file that gets picked up when a widget is being used. And index.js is where you define the module itself. Schemas are the next kind of concept in Apostrophe, and this is basically how you it's an array of objects that define how fields will exist in a particular kind of object in Apostrophe. Schemas are really powerful in that they don't just power the backend like database layer, they also generate user interfaces and allow editors to add content to Apostrophe. So in this example, I'm basically just creating an excerpt field. Name is the thing that gets stored in. Label is what is displayed to the user. The type is the type of schema that I'm going to use. I'm just going to use a string, and I'm going to provide some additional help text for the author so that they can know a little bit more about this. And by using this basic simple example, on the back end, I could generate basically this field here. Not only do I have the ability to add fields here, I can organize the tab bar that's on the left there. I can customize the way that the UI looks. I have full control over how this modal works. And then if I want to display that field, real simple, if you're familiar with Nunjucks or any other kind of templating language, this should look really familiar to you. It's basically just printing that field. This is kind of only halfway there. As I mentioned earlier, what's great about Apostrophe is it provides a way to do in-context editing. This won't allow you to do that, and that's where widgets, singletons, and areas come in. Apostrophe comes out of the box with some standard widgets, such as rich text, images, files, and attachments. But you can kind of create widgets to basically do whatever you want on your site. It could display content from pieces. It could show a slideshow. It could add a link to a page that you're going to allow the author to link to somewhere else. How those get added to pages is using a singleton. This allows you to stick a single widget onto a page. So this is using the Apostrophe command. I'm using a singleton in my view. I'm going to save it to the the current page using data.page. It's going to go into a field called content. And this is my widget that I'm going to use the standard out of the box apostrophe rich text widget. And I'm going to pass it some options so I can customize the toolbar so I can only allow the editing of bold and italic. And that will print something like this for me on the front end. So now I have this field where I can add rich text from the front end right into this spot right on the home page. Areas are like singletons, with the exception that this allows you to add multiple widgets to a single area, editable region of the page. So again, I'm going to use the apos helper as with an area. I'm going to stick it in the current page, data.page, in a region called content. And I'm going to pass the widgets I want to use. So in this context, I'm using the apostrophe rich text. I'm going to use the toolbar. I'm going to modify the toolbar slightly. And I'm going to add apostrophe images here as well and allow them to upload an image to add into the page here. And using that, I get a real simple area on my page where I now can select between rich text and images. Once these are placed on the page, the editor also has the ability to rearrange these in context so that this view can be completely customized based on how my editor wants to add content. Apostrophe also has a CLI built in that helps you scaffold sites. It can do a lot of things. I will say I basically only use it to scaffold a site and add admin users, but it can help you scaffold out other parts of your site as well. To install it, you can use npm I with the global command for Apostrophe CLI. Or if you're like me and you don't like installing globals, you can also use the npx command and use the Apostrophe CLI that way. npx, if you're not familiar, that was introduced in Node since 5.2 and allows you to basically run an executable Node command without having to install it globally. I think actually what it does in the backend is caches it locally on your machine and checks to see if the current version is out of date from what you currently have installed. But it basically allows you to run the latest latest executable without having to really install it globally. But for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to assume that you have the Apostrophe CLI installed, and we're going to use the default Apostrophe command. So to create a new project, this is basically the steps that you would do to do that. I could just call Apostrophe from a directory using the create project command. And then the third argument in my site is going to be the directory that I'm going to create it in. It will generate a whole bunch of files. And when it's done, all you really have to do is cd into that new directory and run npm install to install the dependencies. Once that is done, you can basically add your default admin user so you can log into the site using the node command. Node command on app.js and use the Apostrophe users add, where admin and admin. Admin is the username that I'm going to use, and add them to the admin group. If that runs successfully, you'll get prompted to add a password. And after that's run, you should be able to start your Apostrophe site. And if you go to localhost 3000 and log in, you should see something that's very similar to this. So this is basically showing my homepage, which is the default Apostrophe homepage. There's not really a whole lot to it, just the title and some content. This bar at the top left is my admin menu, and this is all the things that come straight out of the box. So I have the ability to tag things. Global is kind of like a special menu where I can add things to the global content, like a menu. That's where I would put that. Pages will list out all the pages for my site. I have a users where I can manage all the users, my built-in image and file library, and a simple logout. So one of the things that is great about Apostrophe, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is it's extremely extensible. If you go to Apostrophe CMS/extend, there's a ton of modules here that you can install and basically get some functionality straight out of the box, including headless. There's a real simple blog, an events calendar. Workflow is how you add editing capabilities, like a publish versus, it's how you can add a publishing workflow to your site. And also that's where you would add translations. Yeah. So without kind of going too much further into that, why don't we start creating a default Apostrophe site using the CLI, and we'll try adding a widget to the homepage. If you go back to that repository as well, this is the 03 example, and there should be some additional README documentation there if you get stuck. Any questions? Okay. I'll give you guys maybe like 5 minutes to do that. Feel free to post questions in the chat again if you get stuck. I do have a little bit of a cheat code in here. If you want to add something really similar to what was just shown, if you go to this last section in the GitHub repository, there's some sample code that you can use here. I guess I probably didn't really explain this, but the homepage is found in the Apostrophe modules folder that's under my site, lib modules. Under pages in views, you'll see a home.html page. And this is the actual template that was running in the browser before. Does anybody else want a couple more minutes? Okay. Okay, so the last thing we're going to cover today is how to Dockerize Apostrophe. One thing I didn't actually realize, if you had scaffolded the Apostrophe project using the CLI, we actually do pack a Docker file and Docker Compose, which I'll explain in a minute, in there. But we're going to try doing it manually just to get the idea behind how networking works in Docker. So real quick, as explained before, Apostrophe requires Node.js to run Express and MongoDB to store its data. So what you might be thinking from the beginning is I'm going to create an image that does both of these things in one. You probably could do that, but it's not really the right way to think about it. So what you really should be thinking about is each one of these things is basically a container. And that's kind of what is the beauty behind Docker, is that with all of these things separated, I'm able to like scale and connect them all together in kind of in a network where I have control over the individual containers themselves and I can replicate them as needed. So what Docker has networking built in. You can use it using the Docker network commands, which is kind of okay. But if you start to look at this, like I have two containers here that I'm going to connect to my net. So I'm going to create a Docker network called mynet. I'm going to next connect my app to my mynet, and then I'm going to connect my database to mynet. This might be fine if you only have a couple of containers, but this could get really annoying if you have to start to manage this and restart or restop containers in the network individually. So luckily, Docker has built in this Docker Compose commands tool, which is basically does exactly that. It's built for defining and running multi-container Docker applications. And it allows you to do that with a YAML file to configure your application services. And then using a single command, you can start all of them or stop all of them based on what you started with the configuration. A real simple Docker Compose file looks like this. The first key here, the version, that is the Docker Compose version that I'm going to use. I will say there is kind of a big difference between 2 and 3, and there have been some slight differences in between the minor versions as well. So just make sure that the version that you're putting here matches the version of Docker that you have installed on your machine. There is I will post this in the chat. To see the compatibility of Docker Compose with Docker itself, you can visit that link to see the compatibility chart for what version of Docker Compose you should be using. The next key, services. This is where I set up the services for my network. In this one, I have 2 very simple ones, an app and a database. I'm going to build my app from a Docker file. So this is all relative to context of where I'm building my network. So I'm going to assume that there's a Docker file here that defines my application. I can use this next key depends on to signal to my app signal to my network that this app depends on the database. I'll kind of go over this in a second, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it waits for the database to start before the app starts. That's kind of a key thing to think of in Docker Compose. And then my database is real simple. I'm going to use the default MongoDB. I don't even need to define a Docker file here because I can use the image straight from the registry. And I'm gonna have a restart strategy on this image to restart always. And then to start this network, all I have to do is run Docker compose up. That will start all my containers and network. And then if I want to stop it, I can use Docker compose down. That will stop all the things created by up. It will stop and remove containers, networks, volumes, images, anything that's created in that Docker compose file. Some simple compose configuration references. There's a couple more than this. This is kind of the most common ones that I've used. You can also use environment variables in configurations in the bash-like way with like the $, curly brace variable syntax. So to kind of go over these configurations real quick, services, this is kind of what we just saw. This is your top level key where you define all of your services. Build is the configuration options that you want to pass at build time. This could be the context of where this Docker file is, the Docker file you want to use. You can pass arguments this way as well. You can run a command here that might overwrite the default command that's in the Docker file. You can also pass configs here. And if you want to, you can also add a container name here that will display in the log. That's a little bit more user-friendly than the kind of default one that might get generated. Image, this is the image where the container came from. Most times, like you probably won't use a build and image on the same service. You probably would either use one or the other. So I'm gonna either build it from a Docker file or I'm gonna build it from a pre-existing image. Ports, this is the ports you want to expose to the host system. Volumes are any kind of persistent data that you want to mount between the network itself and the host system. This is kind of like really important if you want to like persist data like image uploads, or you have a data directory that you want to kind of like quick start the database with. Depends on, this is where you declare dependency between services. But as noted just before, this doesn't really mean that it's going to wait for the dependencies to be ready. There's some ways to get around this. I'll post in the chat a little bit later where in the Docker documentation this is, but there's some scripts that they provide that you can chain in your command to make sure that Docker waits for a certain service to be ready before it will start another container. So like, for example, in the example of the database, say my app needs to talk to it. Even though I'm declaring depends on, it might not mean that my database is running when my app is trying to start. So these other methods will allow you to kind of wait for things to happen in a certain sequence. Restart is the restart policy, whether I want my container to restart always if it crashes or not. There's an env file key that you can use to add environment variables from either a single file or a series of files. You can also set environment variables right in a Docker Compose file itself. Expose the ports you want to expose and publish them to the host. So this is kind of why I mentioned earlier why I don't typically use expose a lot in Docker files, because I usually put it here so that when I'm looking at my network, it's easier for me to see all the things connected in my compose file versus having to go into all the Docker files and see what is talking to what. And then you can also define networks here. By default, Docker Compose is going to try and network all of your containers together that are defined within the services. But say, for example, I had a legacy app that was running alongside my current application. I could define two different networks and have single parts of my services talk to one network versus the other. And I could do that through a networks key. So with that said, We're going to try and start Dockerizing the Apostrophe project. Like I said earlier, Apostrophe does ship with a default Docker Compose and Dockerfile. So if you create it through the CLI, those files probably already exist, but you can, we'll give it a couple of minutes to see if you want to modify those a little bit. So actually what we might do, I'm going to hang out for a while, but since this is kind of like the last section, if there's any questions right now, I could take some questions for a couple of minutes, and then I'll hang out and kind of help anybody with Docker Compose that wants it. So actually, does anyone have any questions? So before I forget, here's the link to how you can provide startup order in Docker Compose files. Basically, it's this wait for it script where you pass things in order that you want to happen. So in the example that they give, if you're viewing that link, let me see if I can share this. They're using this bash command to wait for their database to be ready on port 5432 before running their Python app. But that's the basic command that you can use to kind of wait for those things to be ordered. Oh. Okay, so, right. So Alex basically asked, he took his Docker file from the O2 example and moved it into 4. And he stopped and removed all of his containers and then tried to rerun, but it's still showing the original Express localhost 3000, where he's expecting it to show the apostrophe site. So, so I think it kind of sounds like you might still have a container somewhere. If you run PS, Docker PS, does anything show? Oh boy. All right, so it looks like all your containers are stopped. If you go to the Docker app dashboard, from your toolbar at the top, you should have like a little Docker icon. Is it showing that no containers running? I would assume so because it doesn't look like any of them are. Oh, shit. I'm gonna pause this real quick. What does it give you if you run this? So I think actually what it's trying to do is rerun this Express server that you have instead of actually starting rebuilding a new container that's going to be the apostrophe site. So like, are you copying in the app.js from apostrophe? So the Docker file that you copied over, we're probably going to want to modify that to copy in the requirements for apostrophe. So I guess one thing I didn't quite cover is everything that you do need to be able to run apostrophe in that container. So one thing, the parts of this that are actually, I'm not even sharing my screen. The parts of apostrophe that are required in that container for it to actually run is the lib modules, the views, the app.js, and minimally the package JSON. So in addition to that file that you had before, where you're just copying in using the copy command to add app.js, you also want to copy in those other files and then run the npm install again to install the apostrophe assets. Did that make sense? I'm kind of tempted to kind of switch over to like the example branch, but I don't want to spoil it for everybody. Would anybody like me to walk through those files real quick? So to create a Docker file for Apostrophe, it's basically the same idea of what's happening here. You'd be using node 12. You're creating a worker that you can start, have basically a starting point for copying all your files. Obviously, we'll need a package JSON. We'll have to run npm install in there after that is added. We need to make sure that we copy our assets in. So as mentioned before, the pieces of Docker or Apostrophe that are really required for it to run are the things that are in lib modules, views, the app.js, and minimally the package JSON. And then you just basically, well, you'd run the node app.js command to start up Apostrophe like you would from your local environment. Where I'm going to spoil it now. So like where all this kind of comes together is inside of the Docker Compose file. This is kind of like where I'm going to link all this stuff together. So I'm basically just using version 3, and I'm going to define my services. So I have an Apostrophe service. I'm going to give it a name of Apostrophe. I always want it to restart. I'm going to use my Docker file that I created. I'm going to expose my ports. So I'm going to map 3000 from the container to my host machine. And I'm going to mount my data directory. So I have persistent data between what's in upload, data uploads, and in my container app public uploads. I'm going to pass a environment variable to tell Apostrophe where my MongoDB is located. And I'm going to say that this service depends on my Mongo service, which is my database. Same thing here. I just give it a name. I'm going to use the default latest Mongo image. I'm going to tell my database I always want it to restart. I'm going to load some data into it from my host data DB directory to the container data DB directory. And I'm going to expose the default Mongo port. Does all this make sense? And then if all of that is configured correctly, from the root of my site, if I run Docker Compose up, I should then see the Apostrophe homepage. Yes. One thing, once your site is up and running, as mentioned before, my host machine doesn't really have access to what's happening in that container. So if I want to add my admin user, I need to be able to get into that container to run the apostrophe commands to add the admin user. So that's where I can use the Docker compose exec command. Or I think it should be Docker exec. I'm just going to start my version 2 so I can do this with you. So I've already created this user, but I'll show you how you can go about doing it. So the first thing I need to do is know what this container is so I can get inside of it. So I do that using Docker PS. This is going to list out the containers that I have running. Here's my apostrophe site with the name that I've given it in the compose file. And this is my default Mongo database. Some stuff here, I'll show you when it was created, how long it's been running, the port mapping, and any names that it's given. These names here match what is set in my Docker compose file. So what I want to do is get into this apostrophe container so I can add the admin user. I'm going to do that by getting the Docker container ID, and then I can exec into it. So I should make this bigger. It is exec IT, I for interactive, and T for I believe it's TTP, sudo TTP. I'm going to give it the container ID and tell it what command I want to run. So I'm going to run the bash bin. So now I'm actually inside of that container. And I can do anything inside here that I would normally with a bash terminal. So in here, you can see I've copied in app.js. Here's my data directory that's inside the container, my lib, the locales that I copied in, the node modules that got installed, the package JSON that got generated when I ran install, my package JSON that I copied in. This public folder is generated by apostrophe when it starts up. Oh, this is the part I forgot to copy in before. So as mentioned, we want to make sure that the database is running prior to apostrophe being started. So apostrophe does include the wait for it command. This is kind of the link that I posted in the chat earlier. This is the bash command that will allow you to wait for something to be started before starting something else. So in order to use it within my container to wait for apostrophe to start, I need to copy that script in. I'll switch back in a second to my GitHub. But once I'm in here, I can run the apostrophe command. So I'm going to run node on app.js. I'm going to do apostrophe users add. I want an admin at admin. It's probably going to blow up because I already have one. It'll prompt me for a password. And now I should have an error because I already have an admin user. If you didn't already have one, You shouldn't see this error. You just would have an admin user, and going to the home page, you should be able to log in with admin, the password you entered. And you can't see that because I'm not sharing it. Any questions with that? All right, so if there's no other questions, yeah, so it is a different process from the first example. Docker Compose is actually going to what starts all the containers in this example versus the other one where I'm just going to run a container off an image. Yeah, so this one, I want to start multiple things and connect them all together. That's what Docker Compose does. So this one, I'm going to use the Docker Compose up command to start everything and connect them all together all at once. Cool. If there's no other questions for tonight, you also can reach us on chat.apostrophe.cms.org. That's our Discord channel. Most of the core maintainers are in there. Feel free to post questions in there too. And lastly, thanks for everybody that made it today. And the Code for Philly group for getting this all set together and making this remote thing work. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Greg, especially for rescheduling. I know it was definitely unexpected, but yeah, I'm really interested to see and explore how Apostrophe can be used for some of the projects we see where I think we have a lot of cases where people, for example, just need really basic websites or simple ways to keep and update content online. So I'm really curious to explore more about it.
Yeah, maybe that's something we could talk about, like doing more of an in-depth, just like Apostrophe kind of thing at some point too. Yeah,
definitely. I think as we see projects too, we'll think more about in the context of Apostrophe, like where it could be a good fit.
Cool.
Yeah, and it also seems like a lot of content-oriented projects could maybe make use of some of Apostrophe's extendability to be the platform for the project, not just a website for the project.
Yeah, exactly. There's a ton of ways that you can use Apostrophe. Headless is a really great example. You can also just expose like certain APIs from within Apostrophe to expose data that you might have in the site to other things.
Yeah, that's a good point. So like even, yeah, not just as like a simple site, but some of the ways people can extend it or use it like from the server, things like that. It seems like for a lot of Code for Philly projects, it's sort of like, yeah, figuring out like different ways people can use the tool and kind of building playbooks around some like common patterns we see with like civic tech projects and stuff like that. Yeah, cool.
Cool.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot. I guess I'll close out. I think Marika's helping with another project, so I'll see if I can go ahead and stop it. But thanks a lot for coming and for sharing.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks.
Yep.
See ya.
I might